he met with Jesus on a number of occasions. He spent time with Jesus, he talked with Jesus, and he shared meals with him over those number of weeks that passed on by. And the third witness that I would refer you to is that of Thomas. Now, Thomas was also a disciple of Jesus, and if he was here this evening, he would say he knew Jesus very well. He'd also spent 3 years or so going around the countryside with Jesus, listening to him. Thomas would tell you that when the other disciples said to him, "We've seen Jesus alive, he's risen from the dead," Thomas would say to you, "I didn't believe them. I just did not believe them. I said to them, if I can't see Jesus for myself, and if I can't put my hands in the scars on his body, then I'm not going to believe he's risen from the dead." Thomas would then tell you, if he was here this evening, that he, some days later, had exactly that experience. He met face to face with Jesus, he talked with Jesus, and at Jesus' invitation, he put his hands on the scars in Jesus' body. And all those witnesses and all the other hundreds that I referred to, if they were here this evening, would stand here categorically and say to you, "I saw Jesus on a number of occasions after he rose from the dead." So that leaves us then, as the court here tonight, with that question. Well, are these witnesses believable? Are they credible? Now, when I have to try and assess a witness who's giving evidence before me, there are a number of factors that go through my mind about what I'm listening to. In the case of identification, I want to know how certain and clear are they that the person they're identifying is the correct person. Now, as far as all these witnesses are concerned, they knew Jesus very well. They had seen him over a long period of time. This wasn't just a case of where they'd glimpsed somebody in a crowd in a distance and thought it might be Jesus. They're telling me, and they're telling you, that they spend a lot of time with Jesus after his resurrection. So I would suggest it's highly improbable that they were mistaken in identifying who this person was and that it was indeed Jesus. Secondly, I look for consistency in a person's evidence. And they were consistent in both what they said at the time and what they said throughout the rest of their lives. They never embroidered it, they didn't change it, they didn't embellish it. Also, what they said on the main principles is consistent with each other. Do I expect all the witnesses in a case to agree with each other on every single point? The answer is no, I don't. If they do, then I get slightly suspicious, because then I think there is a bit of collusion. They have compared notes, and they've made sure that their stories match. I expect witnesses to tell me what they saw from their perspective and their point of view. And that sometimes means there's a bit of difference between them in what they're saying. But on the central issues, they remain the same and consistent. And that is true of the people who give evidence about the resurrection of Jesus. What about their mental state? You always consider that. Well, in our country, the assumption is that everybody knows what they're doing and is competent unless there's evidence to the contrary. And there's clearly no evidence to the contrary as far as these people are concerned. They were upset, they were grieving, but none of them expected Jesus to rise again. What about their motive? Did they have a financial motive? Had anybody paid them to give this evidence? Well, clearly not. Were they going to be famous or have some celebrity status as a result of giving this evidence? No, they didn't. In fact, quite the opposite. Most of them faced a lot of opposition. Many of them faced persecution, and a significant number of them were killed because of what they were saying and because of their statement that Jesus had risen from the dead and what that should mean as far as we are concerned. Just think about Peter for a moment. He was one who died an horrendous death because of what he was saying about the resurrection of Jesus. And yet he was the guy who denied Jesus because he was so worried about him, so worried about his own welfare when Jesus got arrested. Do you think a person who was that scared then would willingly die an horrendous death for something that he knew was so untrue? And lastly, did they simply conspire together to tell the story? Chris referred to this in what he said, and I would suggest they didn't. We read about conspiracies, don't we, in our headlines from time to time, in the big headline cases that we see in our courts these days, and nearly always you find that one or more conspirators, in the end, when they're faced with lots of awful things happening to them, will give evidence for the prosecution and will tell what's called the truth. Now, in the case of all these eyewitnesses, not one single one of them ever, despite all that they faced, changed their story. They maintained to the very end of their lives, however that came about, that they had seen Jesus, they had spent time with him. And I would therefore suggest very strongly to us as the court this evening that we have a very large number of credible witnesses who all agree that Jesus did rise from the dead, and at the very least, we need to consider their evidence extremely carefully and to think about the impact that could have on our lives if they're telling the truth, which I suggest and strongly would argue they are.
Thank you, John. Very, very clearly presented and compellingly put. But you mentioned at the end there about considering their testimony.
Yes.
And then the impact.
Yes.
For you personally, is this more than a mental conviction? What's the impact for you?
Well, the impact for me has simply been rather like Chris, that I got to the point of realizing that this, what I read in the Bible and what I heard from others about the fact that Jesus had risen from the dead meant that from my point of view, I needed to be right with him, because the Easter story includes Good Friday. It includes the death of the Lord Jesus Christ, and we're told in the Bible that he died in our place for the things we have done wrong, and that I needed God's forgiveness, and that he rose again so that that forgiveness is available to me. And so it had that very personal impact as far as I was concerned and am concerned, that it meant that it related to me and demonstrated God's love for me as well as for everyone else.
John, thank you. We really appreciate that. We look
Thank
forward
you.
to hearing from you.
Thank you.
Now, Emily's going to join me up here on the front. Emily, thank you. Now, I know, Emily, you've spent much time over the years discussing many of these things with some very sceptical people at times. I know an awful lot of students as well. Maybe I could ask you, before you share with us, just a personal question. Have you always been overwhelmingly convinced by everything, or have you had questions yourself?
Yeah, I've had questions, and I think it's interesting. When I went to university, I went from a kind of Christian background, but I guess you come to university and you meet people who believe all sorts of different things, and suddenly you have to really think about things and ask questions, and that was my experience. And so there were a lot of questions that were thrown up. There's a lot of searching for truth. But also I think as I've met lots of people who have questions, who are skeptical or seeking, their questions have challenged me as well, and I don't think that's a bad thing. I think maybe I've approached it slightly differently than when I was 18, but still I find today that asking questions of the Christian faith can actually be a really positive thing for me and I guess for everybody.
Thank you, Emily. Well, in terms of asking questions, we want to ask you, aren't there other explanations for these things we've been hearing about this evening?
Yeah,
so over
great.
to you. Thank you.
Okay, so we've already heard from Chris and John and from the physics professor that there's a lot of evidence to look at. There's a lot of evidence from that first Easter morning to examine, that there was an empty tomb, that there are witnesses who claim to have seen Jesus alive. There's these transformed lives and this beginning of the church that we have to ask, where did that come from? Why did the church begin and explode like it did? And I guess we put these pieces of evidence together and we try to come up with the most reasonable explanation. So you might ask, well, surely there are other explanations than just Jesus rose from the dead. And throughout history, people have put forward alternative theories. So we're just going to look at a few of them and see whether they stack up. So first one is the wrong tomb theory. And John Hurley's already referred to this. But some have said, well, when the women went to the tomb on that first morning, they were upset. It was dark. They'd just been through an incredibly traumatic experience. Maybe they went to the wrong tomb. They wrongly assumed that when they found it empty, they thought, well, Jesus must be alive. They went back and told the other disciples, and this idea kind of grew and spread. But as John has already pointed out, you don't forget where a loved one was buried 2 days ago. They watched it happen. But even if they did, and let's assume that they did, their first assumption would not have been that Jesus was alive, that he was risen. That just wasn't in their expectations. They'd come to anoint a dead body. The male disciples were still locked away in hiding, mourning the death of their friend. They weren't expecting a resurrection, and they probably would have been really relieved to find the body so they could continue to mourn properly. But also, if they were at the wrong tomb, Jesus' followers would be remembered to this day as the laughingstock of the ancient world. The authorities who had Jesus killed would have produced a body, taken every opportunity to make a mockery of these Christians' claim of resurrection, and the church would never have got off the ground in the way that it did. Okay, number 2, the hallucination theory. Now, we know human minds are powerful and kind of mysterious things, and people throughout history have believed all sorts of weird and wonderful things that are not true. And so some have concluded that the followers of Jesus, who claimed to see him alive, only did so in their minds. They were swept along with each other by something that was so comforting and so empowering for them personally. Well, people have applied the insights of psychiatry to that historical witness to weigh this up. And they agree that several conditions should be present for hallucinations to happen, and this situation just doesn't fit that. Firstly, hallucinations generally occur to people of a particular disposition, people who are imaginative or a bit of a nervous disposition, but the appearances of Jesus occur to a wide range of people. Also, hallucinations are subjective and individual. They're not communal. Because they're happening in your own mind, they're not shared. No two people would have exactly the same hallucination at the same time. But in the case of the appearances of Jesus, over 500 people on one occasion said they saw him at the same time. And hallucinations only occur at particular times and places, usually associated with the events. But the resurrection appearances occurred in many different places, many different times, and for a set period. And finally, if some continue to argue for this position, they still have to account for the empty tomb. Even if the disciples were dreaming up that they saw Jesus, where was his body? When they started preaching, all the authorities would have needed to do was produce and parade a body to end their dreaming. So number 3, the swoon theory. So a third theory goes that Jesus wasn't actually dead when he was taken down off the cross and placed in the tomb. He'd simply passed out. He was mistaken for dead, and then in the cool of the tomb, he came round and he escaped the next day. And when he then met his disciples, the conclusion was he must have risen. Now, this theory became very popular in the 19th century, but it's been discredited for quite obvious reasons. One is that the Romans were very good at killing people. Crucifixion is where we get the word excruciating from. The Roman soldiers had a very strong incentive to make sure he was dead. It could have been their own heads if he was alive and had escaped. Also, the record tells us they took several precautions to make sure he was dead. When they came to break the legs of the prisoners who were being killed alongside him, they examined him, found he was already dead. But just to make sure, they stabbed a spear into his side. And it says that blood and water came out separately. That's a medical sign that death has already occurred. His body was then taken down and wrapped up by one of his own followers, who would no doubt have carefully handled him and checked for signs of life. But even if Jesus did survive the torture of his flogging and of the cross, the idea that he could then unwrap himself from tightly bound grave clothes, weighed down with 80 pounds of spices, roll back an enormous stone single-handedly, either escape notice of the guards who were guarding the tomb or fight them off just on his own, unarmed, walk several miles, and then appear to his disciples as if he had victoriously He defeated death rather than from the dead and was worthy of worship as their Lord and God. But finally, this theory also depends on Jesus being perhaps the greatest liar and hoaxer of all history. And any understanding of his character would make this very doubtful. Read for yourself some of the accounts of Jesus' life and judge what kind of man he was. Would he have deceived his friends in such a way, or allowed them to believe such a radical and dangerous idea if it wasn't actually true? What about the fourth theory, the stolen body? Now, this is one of the oldest conspiracies around Jesus' resurrection. In fact, Matthew reveals in his gospel that as the news of the empty tomb began to spread around Jerusalem and reach the Jewish leaders, in desperation, they invented this conspiracy, bribing the Roman soldiers who'd been guarding the tomb to say that they fell asleep during the night and the disciples came and stole the body. But could it be true? Could the disciples have stolen the body to give legitimacy to this new movement that they were starting? Well, this theory has been scrutinized by a lot of people, and I would say the biggest flaw is in the motive. When Jesus died, the disciples thought it was the end of everything that they'd hoped for. They were afraid and despairing, worried that their turn was next. And although Jesus had predicted his own death and resurrection very clearly to them, on the third day, they weren't waiting expectantly or primed to celebrate. They were in a house with locked doors. Resurrection just wasn't something that they connected with their idea of the Messiah and what the Messiah would do and who he would be. And yet a few days later, as we've already talked about, they were transformed from shivering wrecks into passionate, bold preachers, willing to sacrifice everything for this claim. And there was nothing to gain. This claim was the center of the Christian church beginning. Even though there was so much fierce opposition, it was countercultural, it didn't offer anything like the political freedom or national glory that many Israelites were looking for at the time. So if this was all a hoax, the disciples would have given up absolutely everything for a lie and got nothing in return. But also the circumstances make it unlikely. As we've already said, the tomb was guarded. It was a well-known public tomb. And this theory doesn't account for the many people who said that they saw Jesus alive. Not just his closest disciples, but many people, including those who were skeptical, like his own brother. And all these witnesses were around and living at the time that the church was growing, so they could have been cross-examined by those who wanted to uncover any kind of hoax. So finally, the substitution theory. Let's just consider this last claim that it wasn't actually Jesus who died on the cross and was buried, but it was a substitute. Some said it could have been somebody who looked like him, others that God changed the appearance of someone to look like him. And in fact, this theory is held by some Muslims based on an interpretation of a passage in the Quran. It says, "But they killed him not, nor crucified him, so it's made to appear to them." Some understand this to mean that a lookalike of Jesus was killed on the cross, but Jesus was taken up to heaven. And I guess this is based on an assumption that God would not have allowed his Messiah or his prophet to die such a humiliating death of a criminal. But whether or not you're religious, this theory can still be questioned. And the obvious weakness, as John has already said, is that the witnesses knew who Jesus was. Those who testified to what happened were able to identify Jesus. The idea that nobody noticed that there was a mistake in this public execution is just very far-fetched. And also, the idea that God deliberately made somebody look like Jesus to be crucified instead of him is not consistent with what Jesus said about his own death, that he was the one who would give his life in sacrifice for the sake of others. Also, on the question of whether Jesus' death diminishes the glory of God, the Christian conviction is that by conquering death through the resurrection, Jesus brought greater glory to God than any escape from the cross ever could have done. So when you've considered all these other explanations and their weaknesses, I would say we're still left with a resurrection-shaped hole in history. One I would argue can only be filled by the most surprising and yet the most reasonable explanation, that Jesus really did die and rise again, and that has enormous implications for all of us. The resurrection is the only explanation that makes sense of all those facts, and I did challenge all of us to consider for ourselves, to apply reason, but also to have an openness that we might be surprised by what we find out, and that the most outrageous claim might actually be true and profoundly relevant to all of us.
Well, Emily, thank you very much. That was incredibly clear and very, very helpful. And it's clear from what you've shared there about this, I love that resurrection-shaped hole in history. And you talk about the implications being significant. I want to ask you about, if you like, the daily implication for you. I mean, for example, I'm convinced by a number of significant things in history. I'm convinced by, Mount Vesuvius and the destruction of Pompeii. I'm convinced that the First World War happened and came to an end, and we recognise that once every year in November. But does that really have an ongoing daily moment-by-moment impact on my life? Does it have implications in that way? Not really. Is it something that's very different for you? I mean, does this have a daily implication?
Yeah. I remember actually when I first heard somebody explain the evidence for the resurrection like we have tonight, I just thought, and so what? That's kind of interesting, but I don't really understand how it means anything for me. But I think as life has gone on, and as I guess I've witnessed this world being in a lot of times very dark, very difficult. People go through really difficult things, both people close to me, but also on a broader scale. Like I was reflecting this afternoon on the people who've been killed in Sri Lanka today. And when you look at this world with all of its issues, and you ask where's hope, and where's an answer to those questions in our hearts about suffering and about pain and about what happens when we die, and does it all mean anything, and does evil win in the end, or does good win? I think that's where I've realised, actually, if Jesus is alive, it means that he wins, and that death's not the end, and that has meaning for every day. Yeah.
Emily, thank you so very much. Thank you. Well, we're going to take a brief pause now. We'll be back again at 1:30, so 5, 6, 7 minutes we'll take. While that's happening, Enoch's going to play just to give us a musical interlude. There's a number of things that I'd encourage you to maybe consider doing during this time. The number's going to remain on the screen if you want to text in questions. Some have come in already. There are also question cards. For any one of you who wants to make use of those, write your question down, pass it along, and someone from the welcome team will come along and pick those up. The other thing is we've got a book table. There'll be time after